Hello, international commercial terms, or Incoterms as they're more commonly known, have been with us since 1936 and they're a key part of trading overseas. I'm Ian Forsyth and with me today is Ewan Ramsey, who's going to be taking us through some of the things that you need to be aware of in relation to Incoterms. Potentially quite a confusing area, there are 11 of them out there. But we'll try and make it as simple as possible for you and make sure we cut to the key important information around these Incoterms. So Ewan, I think it's always useful to start off by looking at some of the pitfalls. What are the dangers of not getting it right with Incoterms?
I think quite often people view the Incoterm as the contract or as the entire agreement, whereas Incoterms is really all about delivery and it's all about payment, insurance, documentation, and whether the buyer or the seller is responsible for each of these three elements of the shipment. So I think one of the important things to understand is there's no right or wrong Incoterm. Very much the Incoterm that suits you and your customer, suits you best. And it's all about eliminating risk, but don't go under the assumption that once you've sorted your Incoterm, then you've got a cast iron concrete contract. So there are lots of other aspects to the transaction that need to be thought about and implemented in the appropriate manner.
Now, we will cover the fact that you don't need to know all of them, because when you look at the list, I think there's 11, isn't there? We'll be looking at later on.
Yeah.
Where do you even start?
I think it's, when it comes to international trade, from my perspective, it's all about eliminating risk. And you want to be entering into a contract that you want to enter into, as opposed to being coerced or pushed into a corner and you're entering into a contract either that you're not comfortable with, or quite often you see companies that enter into a contract that they don't understand. And that can be a very difficult and challenging place to be when you're entering the world of exporting.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. We'll almost certainly develop that in a bit more detail. But let's go over to the first of the short films that we've recorded for you. This one looks a little bit at Incoterms, where they've come from, what they are, how they work, and more importantly, why you need to know about them.
The nature of international trade is such that parties to a contract may be unfamiliar with trading practices in their respective countries, which can often lead to misunderstandings. The International Chamber of Commerce recognised the need for clarification of obligations and responsibilities of buyers and sellers in international trade contracts. As a result, International Commercial Terms, or Incoterms, were first published in 1936. Since then, Incoterms have been reviewed on a regular basis, with the most up-to-date version being updated in 2010. Incoterms are accepted globally by governments, legal authorities and practitioners for the interpretation of the most commonly used terms in international trade. When exporting for the first time, the concept of Incoterms can be fairly daunting and confusing for businesses. However, here we are going to take a brief overview of Incoterms to provide a basic introduction to some of the key elements. Trying to learn all the things that you need to know about Incoterms in one go will only lead to further confusion and uncertainty. Before thinking about the specific terms used within Incoterms, you should spend time understanding the commercial terms you as a business would like to enter into, as this will put Incoterms into more context. When developing commercial agreements in international trade, it is important to look to enter into the agreements you would like to make rather than being coerced into the agreement that you are not comfortable with or that doesn't fit your business model or process. You will be relieved to hear that in reality, once you have a basic understanding of Incoterms and how it relates to your business, you can fairly easily assemble enough knowledge to ensure that you can limit your exposure and protect yourself when trading globally. Once you understand the basics of Incoterms, other bits of the export jigsaw fall into place, which is extremely helpful in developing your overall export knowledge.
So Ewan, the film talked about, understanding the terms of business that you want to enter into. Can you give us some examples of the sorts of things we were talking about there?
Yeah, I think if you take Ex Works as an Incoterm, and many people view Ex Works as the simplest to understand. So if you're manufacturing your product, you're responsible as the seller for manufacturing the goods, laying them outside your factory ready for collection, and your responsibility is up to that point. So if you may decide to use that Incoterm, if you want a nice clean transaction that's a simple shipment, you get paid up front, and then it's the buyer's responsibility to arrange the freight forwarder to come and take it away, and that's all nice and easy. If, however, you are exporting some portable, tangible goods and they're going overseas, and that's the first part of a transaction, maybe the second element is you have to bring on board people from your own company to go overseas to then install the goods. Once they've landed in that country, then you might want to use a different Incoterm, something like DDP, Delivery Duty Paid. And the reason for that is that you can control the whole flow of the transaction and the shipment from your factory right the way to the destination place. And that way you can tie up your own staff, getting them to fly out into the other country of destination to arrive at the time that your goods arrive there. So it's all about risk and it's all about control. And what I would always say to companies, there is, as I said earlier, there's not a right or wrong Incoterm. But it's all about which parts of the shipment do you want to have control over. That can then determine which is the most appropriate Incoterm for you to implement for the transaction.
Okay, the film also makes a kind of bold claim that once you understand Incoterms, the rest of the jigsaw kind of falls into place as far as overseas trade's concerned. Tell us a bit more. Is that pushing it a bit?
Well, I think it's. I always try and simplify things when it comes to exporting, especially for the first time exporter. It can be quite daunting when you've never exported before, and at the beginning you don't know what you don't know, so you're uncertain as to what questions to ask. So everything from my perspective is I have this imaginary toolbox at my side. You've never exported before, you've got nothing in it. As you develop your knowledge and your understanding, so we talk about payment methods in last week's webinar.
Yep.
Some of the bits of the jigsaw start to make sense. Once you learn more about Incoterms, then some more of the jigsaw falls into place. The next webinar, we're talking about agents and distributors, and then we also look at documentation. And it's all about just plugging in these different parts of the jigsaw, and eventually it'll all start to make sense. But the secret, as I've always found in exporting, is you will never know everything about Incoterms. But the beauty of having a toolkit there is that you know where to look to get the right appropriate information.
Okay, so it's not the whole jigsaw, it's one of the bits that we're looking at.
One of the very important bits, because it kind of hangs together payments, documentation, shipping, freight, logistics, commercial contracts, and it really binds all of these aspects together.
Okay, in the second film, we're going to look at the three basic areas that Incoterms actually cover. So let's go over and see what Tanya has to tell us about Incoterms and the areas covered by them.
Logistics is defined as all the operations involved in moving goods from the time they are manufactured until they have been taken over by the end user. Logistics relates to packing, storing, handling, transit, insurance and custom clearance. For example, when goods purchased for country B are manufactured in country A, moving these goods from the factory to final destination entails a series of logistical operations, ranging from packing the goods, export clearance, transport from factory to country A, port or airport, international transport, transport from country B, port or airport to final destination, handling, insurance during transport, and import clearance. All these operations include costs which must be paid either by the buyer or the seller. In order to avoid misunderstanding and to reduce the risks of costly disputes between the buyer and the seller, the International Chamber of Commerce, or ICC, has developed a set of international and official rules for the interpretation of trade terms. These are called Incoterms. Incoterms are a standard coded language understood by everyone involved in international trade, including buyers, sellers, freight forwarders, carriers, and customs officials. Incoterms deal only with the relationship between the seller and the buyer under the contract of sale, but they don't apply to the contract of carriage. Furthermore, they don't cover all aspects of the contract of sale. For example, they don't provide for all of the duties which parties may wish to include in a contract of sale. Incoterms essentially look to define three basic elements in a commercial transaction. If we consider that we primarily use Incoterms to reduce any misunderstanding between the buyer and the seller in an international commercial transaction, they would define the following three basic elements. The place, where the seller delivers the goods to the buyer. Costs, what the seller pays to the point of delivery, unless otherwise agreed with the buyer. And risk, where the seller passes the transit risks to the buyer.
So it sounded there from the film that Incoterms are all about the logistics of essentially getting the product from the seller to the buyer.
Yeah.
I suppose the kind of fundamental question is that's going to happen anyway, so why do we need Incoterms?
It's all about delivery, and it's all about eliminating risk and clarifying responsibilities. It also helps very clearly in how the seller ends up pricing the product. If you think about all of the different steps in the shipping process, you need to understand the payment, the amount, who's responsible for that. You need to understand documentation, who is responsible for completing the documentation and what documentation is required, and also the insurance, so in terms of covering the risk. And Incoterms is all about defining at what stage delivery takes place. And delivery is defined as when the risk of loss moves from the seller to the buyer. Now, if there is any grey areas within there, then all you're doing is opening up a whole degree of uncertainty, both to the buyer and the seller. And I guess I work with companies when these problems arise very often. And these problems can arise as part of the shipping process. So you can have goods stuck in port if the documentation's not done properly, or something can happen to the goods, so you may then have a claim on insurance, and then you find out that the goods aren't insured. Right. So you really need clarity at the very beginning when you're trying to create and develop a contract. And really it isn't just the sales function within a company that should be identifying what the most appropriate Incoterm is. The finance and the production all have an element of a role really in terms of identifying what is the most appropriate Incoterm.
You mentioned early on there that it can have an impact on pricing.
Yeah.
How does that work?
If you haven't identified an Incoterm as the seller, then it's very unclear what needs to be built into the price when you are providing a quotation to the buyer. If you're selling under Ex Works, it's relatively simple. You're responsible for manufacturing the goods and the product, and then you have them there ready to get picked up by the buyer. So there's no transportation or shipping costs or customs duties and taxes built into that cost. If you're delivering under DDP, delivery duty paid, then it is your responsibility as the seller to cover all of the shipping costs, the freight, the customs, the duties and the taxes. So for you to provide an all-in price under the DDP Incoterm to your customer, you have to not only understand that that is your responsibility, you have to understand what these costs are. So if you haven't done your research for the destination market, for example, and you don't understand the relevant and appropriate customs duties and taxes, for example, you can then get hit with a nasty surprise. So you may think that's what the customs duties and taxes will be, but the reality might be something very different. and you'll then be at risk and you may have to take a hit on that transaction.
Okay, but we also heard in the film that not all aspects of the transaction would necessarily be covered by Incoterms.
Correct.
Surely that must create bits of confusion and issues for people.
It will create confusion if the buyer and the seller use the Incoterm as the contract in itself. Incoterm doesn't cover issues to do with labelling, for example, any regulatory issues to do with your product moving into a particular market. You then have the sales contract, with which the Incoterm may be part of that sales contract. So it's important to understand that Incoterms are there to define the shipment of portable, tangible goods, and it's all about where the risk passes from the seller to the buyer in as much as the delivery of these goods, but it doesn't cover all these other aspects of the commercial transaction.
Right, okay, we'll probably come back to that, but in the next film, we're going to look at the 11 Incoterms that are currently in place. But as we've heard already, and we'll hear again in the film, don't panic, you don't actually need to know all of them off by heart. But let's hear a little bit more about the 11 Incoterms.
There are currently 11 Incoterms, which were last updated in 2010. If you are new to exporting and have never heard of Incoterms before, let alone have an understanding of how it affects how you export, then it is important to initially take a step back and consider how Incoterms will impact on your own business, its business model, appetite for risk, and the markets you are looking to trade with. It would be unusual, certainly in the early stages of exporting, to have to acquire a detailed working knowledge of each and every Incoterm. Firstly, learning everything there is to know about all 11 terms can be confusing and complicated. It can also be counterproductive. If you don't have any possible need to use a certain Incoterm, it can be confusing when trying to understand how it impacts on a commercial transaction within your business. To begin with, I would recommend that you always begin with assessing the type of commercial transactions that you would like to put into effect with customers and suppliers, always looking at the 3 basic elements mentioned before: place, costs, and risk, and the impact on the transaction. Now you need to begin to get acquainted with the terminology. Each Incoterm has a 3-letter acronym based on the English description, and we will explain in more detail what the different Incoterms are. The easiest Incoterm to understand and get to grips with is EXWORKS, which has the 3-letter acronym EXW. This Incoterm identifies that the place of delivery is the warehouse. The seller packs for export and prepares for dispatch and pays for the resulting costs, and the risk is passed from the seller to the buyer when the goods are available for the buyer to collect.
Now, you're going to have to be patient here, because I think it's probably me being a bit stupid, but I think I've got my head around, the 11 terms and what they are. But I'm still not totally clear about how you decide when to use them or how to use them. And as I say, maybe the audience are sitting out there saying they've grasped this completely. So for my benefit, humour me, how do you decide?
It really comes down to a number of factors, but it's who's best placed to carry out the activity. So if you are shipping goods to a destination market, do you have experience of that market? Do you understand how the customs duties, taxes and the logistics operate within that marketplace? That may determine whether you want to agree an Incoterms where you're, as the seller, in control of all of these aspects. If, however, you want to do a nice, simple, clean-cut exporting where you maybe only want to export under EXWORKS, so that you manufacture your product, you label it, you package it, you have your commercial invoice, you have it ready for collection and you get paid, then that's what you're good at as a business, and that's the areas that you want to deliver, and that would be your part of the Incoterm. So it's really horses for courses. There isn't a right or a wrong Incoterm, but it's very much understanding the flow of the transaction. What I would also always do at the beginning is I would talk to my freight forwarder. Now, For new exporters, a freight forwarder is really a freight company that arranges to take the product from A to the destination place B. They can help you with documentation, they can help you with formalities at customs and duties. And it's very much a case of try and talk to the freight forwarder, understand their experience of a particular marketplace. If you're trying to ship goods to the USA, for example, make sure that your freight forwarder has regularly done that and that they've got good connections and previous experience of taking the product into the United States. So ask questions and really understand every single bit of the overall process.
Taking a step back though, at the point where you're actually looking at your product and what it is that you're looking to export, how do you fit that in, or how do you fit the Incoterms in around that? Because it sounds like it's all part and parcel of the same thing.
Well, it is, and quite often I get situations where the sales arm of a business want it to be really nice and simple and clean so that they can have the easiest sales pitch, if you like. Mm-hmm. So they might not want to get cluttered up with customs duties and taxes. So they may say, let's sell under X works. However, from the logistics or the finance part of the company, there might then be that risk factor whereby you're not in control of any of these elements of the process. So the goods might not get through customs, and if it's done under X works, it's not your responsibility at that stage. So that really takes away your ability to influence that transaction at that stage, because the risk is already passed from yourself to the buyer. So it's not just a case of looking at an Incoterm in isolation, and it's not the finance team having a quick look at what Incoterm suits them, because it needs to suit both the finance, the purchasing and the sales part of the business. And it really helps all aspects of the business at an operational perspective really linking together, understanding your pricing and maintaining margin.
Okay, so you've said a couple of times there's no kind of right or wrong Incoterm, and I think,
No.
and I get what you mean in general terms there, but what you've said seems to imply though there could be a wrong Incoterm for you if you get it wrong in the context of your business?
Very much so, and it is all about doing what's right for you as a business. Some countries have very differing rules for customs and duties clearance. Therefore, it may be inadvisable for you to go down the path of a certain Incoterm where you've got no experience of that country and you're taking the onus and the responsibility for clearing customs and for working out all the customs taxes and things. We talked last week in terms of payment methods, really trying to understand your market, understanding all of the aspects surrounding that market. Incoterms is a great example of that, because you really need to understand. In some countries, they would maybe say, don't export into this country under a certain range of Incoterms because you will likely come across the following problems and challenges. So as with payment terms, if you're trying to move into a new marketplace, talk with the SDI offices over in that country, UKTI, come directly to Inverness Chamber, and we can help navigate you through some of the pitfalls and the challenges of exporting into a particular marketplace. And I would always say that the freight forwarders are very, very useful in that regard, especially if you're exporting to maybe some of the more developing countries around the world that have varying rules and regulations to do with customs and duties that possibly aren't quite as consistent as they could be.
Right, okay. Possibly quite as consistent.
Yeah.
I think we know where you're probably going with that one. We're going to look in this next film where Tanya's going to talk in a little bit more detail about Incoterms. But before we do go into that film, just a reminder, we've had one or two questions in from the audience, which is great. Keep them coming, because this is the second from last film. After we go through the last film and have a chat with you, and we're going to be taking your questions. So make sure you get them in as quickly as possible. So now, over to Tanya to hear a little bit more about the 11 Incoterms.
As you begin to learn about Incoterms, the practical implications of using each different term becomes apparent from a practical perspective. Each Incoterm outlines who is responsible for transport, insurance, duties and clearance. Before you use Incoterms, consider the country of the buyer. Some countries stipulate that set Incoterms are used, while others set chosen Incoterms as standard practice. Transport may also affect your choice, as some Incoterms can only be used for transport by sea and inland waterways. Choosing the most appropriate Incoterm for the market you are selling to is a critical part of your market entry strategy and is an area which is often overlooked when conducting early market research. The Incoterms 2010 are organised into 2 categories. Incoterms for any mode or modes of transport, EXW, ex-works, FCA, free carrier, CPT, carriage paid to, CIP, carriage and insurance paid, DAT, delivered at terminal, DAP, delivered at place, and DDP, delivered duty paid. Incoterms for sea and inland waterway transport only. FAS, free alongside ship, FOB, free on board, CFR, cost and freight, CIF, cost, insurance and freight. When you initially assess the most appropriate Incoterm for your transaction or particular geographical market, it is useful to use a table, such as the one we have on the screen just now. This particular table sets out in an easy-to-read format the different responsibilities that the buyer and seller have with respect to the particular Incoterm. Although each of the 11 Incoterms are very specific in terms of what they mean and the rules and principles surrounding them, you still have to be very careful in your interpretation, as you must be aware of the context around the transaction to avoid further misunderstandings and potential costs.
Now, we've touched on it already about specific countries having specific requirements in relation to Incoterms, but the film emphasises that again.
Yeah.
How does that work? What do you need to be aware of there?
I think it really comes down to your research and your understanding of the market. The slide that's just been up on the screen, which is the allocation of responsibilities for the buyer and the seller, is a fantastic tool to have in your toolbox. And when I start to move into a new marketplace, when I work with a brand new customer in that market, I will always use that, even to this day, as my template to understand which of the Incoterms I would like to use for that particular transaction in that marketplace. One thing that I would always do is sit down with my freight forwarder when I'm entering into a new country. A few years ago, I started exporting a product into East Africa, and I sat down with the freight forwarder really to understand some of the pitfalls of exporting into that country, some of the Incoterms that were probably not advisable to use, and I then was able to eliminate probably 8 or 9 Incoterms straight away as not advisable for a whole range of risk reasons for my business. I was then able to really understand at what point in the shipment process I was at risk. And it was really all about understanding your risk points and making it as clear and concise as possible helps you choose the right Incoterm for that transaction. But it may be that what is the right Incoterm for East Africa for you as a business might be the wrong Incoterm if you're exporting to North America. And that might have as much to do with that country and the processes and the regulations within that country as it impacts on your own business as well on an operational basis.
Okay, so the kind of business culture plays a part depending on the market.
It does.
The film also touched on potential for misunderstandings if you don't get the kind of context right.
Yeah.
Where do those misunderstandings come in?
I think, again, if you take DDP as an Incoterm, DDP is where the seller is responsible for all costs to the destination place, and that's freight, logistics, customs, duties and taxes. But unless you stipulate who is paying the local taxes, the local VAT in that destination market, you can have a grey area there. So you would tend to find that if I was selling under DDP, but I wanted the buyer to be responsible for VAT in their own country, I would put DDP VAT unpaid
Right.
Now, quite often, the grey area arises in that you would just have DDP as the Incoterm. There would be no mention of VAT unpaid, and regularly I get brought in to resolve an issue where the seller assumes that the buyer is picking up the local VAT. The buyer assumes that the seller's paying it because the Incoterm is DDP and there is no mention of VAT there. So that's just a small example where you think by covering off an Incoterm, you've covered off all the potential areas for misunderstanding, but actually you're creating an area for misunderstanding by not following it through to the final degree.
So think through all the potential
Very much
implications. Okay. Moving on to our last film. This time we're going to cover the obligations on a seller that Incoterms imply. So let's hear finally from Tanya about the seller's obligations.
It is important to understand what your obligations are as a seller in relation to Incoterms. Care should also be taken when communicating with the buyer in a new market. Additional words are sometimes included in draft contracts, in addition to the simple three-letter acronym, which may lead to confusion if you, the seller, do not understand the meaning. For example, EXW loaded is sometimes added to the contract wording if the seller is to load the goods. However, if you choose to add words or clauses to your contract, you must make clear in writing who carries out or pays for the extra work and who bears the risk. When you are selling goods overseas and the buyer provides you with a draft contract to sign, you must at all times be absolutely certain of what you are entering into by way of contract, as failure to do so may result in additional cost further down the line. In some shipping contracts, traders will use shipping terms such as terminal handling charges in relation to FCA, free carrier. Costs and risks of these charges, which refer to fees charged by shipping lines for loading or using containers, may differ depending on the port. You must clarify what this means for both buyer and seller. As a rule, when contracts use terms that add or vary from standard Incoterms, they must be explained in detail in each contract. Another important factor when assessing the most appropriate Incoterm is to talk with your insurance broker and freight forwarder to ensure that your goods are able to be insured for the stages of the transaction you are responsible for, and to make sure your freight forwarder understands your wishes. It is also good practice to ensure that the buyer has adequate insurance protection from the moment they take ownership of the goods to avoid any mishaps or issues surrounding potential accidents or losses.
So we finished there with some advice on insurance in relation to Incoterms. From the seller's perspective, what are the sorts of things that they need to be aware of around insurance?
They need to be aware of risk, and they need to be aware of the Incoterm that they choose. Incoterms, as we've touched on already, is all about delivery, and it's all about at what point in the process does the risk move from the buyer to the seller. So as a seller, you want to make sure that all of that risk is eliminated from an insurance perspective. And the worst case scenario is that you have a point in time throughout the shipment where the goods are uninsured, or that you make some assumptions that the buyer has got insurance in place. So you always need to be very clear as to where these potential risk points are going to fall. And what I always urge my exporters to do is to sit down with their own insurance broker or with a reputable insurance broker that deals with international trade and understands the markets that they're trying to move into, and really to look at that audit perspective of where the risks might sit. As with everything to do with international trade, don't make assumptions. Don't assume that because you're going under X works and that the buyer is picking up the goods from your factory, don't just make an assumption that these goods are going to be insured from the minute that they leave your premises. Ask the question. Make sure that you see some evidence that the insurance is in place. Otherwise, you can land yourself in a position where something happens to the goods. There's lack of clarity, there's uncertainty as to who is responsible and who at the end of the day is going to pick up the pieces.
Right. So it's all about getting that responsibility clarified.
Very much so.
Okay. Well, I'm very conscious that time is marching on. We've got a question here from George, and George is asking, is it worth using a third-party company, for example, Western Union, to export for you?
I think companies like Western Union can play a very important part in the export transaction. The one thing I would say, if you're exporting portable, tangible goods, chances are you will use a freight forwarder at some stage. Some of the common mistakes are that exporters, some of them, have the view that I don't need to worry about all these aspects of exporting because my freight forwarder will deal with it all. That can be quite a dangerous strategy in terms of exporting, and again, that would translate over to companies like Western Union. So long as you're understanding what you are actually asking Western Union or your freight forwarders to do on your behalf, what the implications are for the different tasks that you're asking them to do, that can be a very effective way of helping you export into a range of different markets and make sure that you get paid, when in fact trying to do it all yourself might be far more complicated or might have impact on your own capacity as a business. So yes, in the right circumstances, I would say, but make sure that you are understanding all of the different pitfalls and the different elements of their assistance, because at the end of the day, if the documentation's not completed correctly, if the insurance isn't in place and you don't get paid, then it's you as a business that are liable and responsible, and you don't want to be left picking up the pieces.
Okay, so ultimately it comes back to you.
Very much so.
My second daft laddie question of the day. You've been talking about goods here. Do Incoterms apply at all to services, or is it just goods?
The vast majority of the time it's to do with portable goods.
Right.
There could be very occasional situations where you could have a supply contract that has the majority of services, but there is an element of portable, tangible goods built into it. But in the vast majority of time, it would not relate specifically to services.
Right. So it's a good, not quite goods only, but it's close enough.
Yeah.
We did have a question from someone that when selling into the USA, my customer told me that Incoterms aren't applicable.
No. Exporting into the USA can be very challenging for a range of different reasons, and what I would always say to that is just come back to the first principles that we've talked about in terms of Incoterms. Incoterms are on a global scale. Some countries may have certain interpretations of the different 11 Incoterms. That's another reason why you want to be absolutely clear and precise what you mean by that Incoterm. So you're spelling it out in the sales contract or in the agency agreement or in whatever is the commercial agreement that you're building round about the Incoterm. So it's just as applicable in the US as it is elsewhere, but just be careful and make sure that you're covering off all your bases.
Okay, so we managed to dispel a myth there.
Yeah.
If nothing else today, we've certainly dispelled the American myth then in terms
Indeed.
of Incoterms. We're almost out of time, but I'm conscious of the fact that we've got another webcast coming up very soon. And the next time round, we're going to be looking at appointing and managing agents, which we kind of almost started to touch on there. This is your opportunity again, Ewan. It's your time to sell it to the viewers. Why can they not miss out on that next webcast?
Appointing the right agent or distributor can be absolutely vital for you to successfully take a product into a new market. The difference between choosing the right agent or distributor as opposed to one that isn't as effective can really impact on your ability to successfully move into that marketplace. So there are lots of myths, there are lots of assumptions made when it comes to appointing agents and distributors. There can be different things to look out for in different parts of the world and in different parts of the EU. So it isn't a consistent framework within the European Union, although there are lots of directives in and around agency law. So the next webinar will touch on some really practical hints and ideas and thoughts that can enable you to choose the right and the most appropriate agent and distributor for the market that you're trying to move into.
Because again, it's like any business relationship, I imagine. If you get it right, then there's huge potential plus sides, but the converse of that, get it wrong.
It can kill the opportunity in a market, and it can leave you as the exporter with a whole bunch of liabilities that you didn't expect. Whereas you may believe that you're looking at it as a great sales opportunity. If you choose the wrong option, it can really, really stop that particular market.
Okay, so in our next session, that's what we'll be covering.
Yeah.
And that session's coming up in a couple of weeks' time. It's on Thursday the 12th of March, same time, 12 o'clock, so we look forward to seeing you there if you haven't booked already. Just before we go though, just to remind you that some of the slides that have been on today as part of the pre-recorded sessions, you can download them from underneath the video window. You can also click on the link to the Smart Exporter page on Highlands and Islands Enterprises website, where there's a whole range of information, some of the things that Ewan's talked about in relation to places that you should go and things to see, and also of course if you want to book on any of the other workshops or webinars that are going to be run over the next couple of months. So click on the link immediately below this window and that will take you through to Highlands and Islands Enterprises Smart Exporter webpage. So all that remains is for me to say thanks very much for joining us. We really hope you'll be able to come back again on Thursday the 12th of March, so that's a couple of weeks from now, Thursday the 12th of March, when we'll be looking at appointing and managing agents. Thanks for joining us.